But apart from this conflict between different notions of international law, self-determination, and territorial integrity, and geopolitical interests, there are also other factors. Let's just very briefly look at that. First of all, foreign policy orientations of the parties to the conflict. In case of Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, they have demonstrated obvious Euro-Atlantic integration tendencies, and also they had Georgia and Ukraine had democratic revolutions, and Moldova also adopted pro-Western foreign policy after recent elections. Azerbaijan has remained non-aligned and maneuvered between the West, Russia, Islamic and Turkic world, and mostly maintaining the balance of power and adjusting its tactics in line with changing geopolitical circumstances. Armenia has declared multi-vector complementary foreign policy in 1990s. However, at one point, apparently, it has become more increasingly dependent on Russia in terms of energy, economy, and security. There has been apparently a clash between foreign policy alliances of Armenia and foreign policy choices and its value system, because on one side, it has been much more democratic and committed to human rights than Azerbaijan. There is a huge gap between Armenia and Azerbaijan in this sense. On the other side, while making its foreign policy choices, such as becoming a member of Collective Security Treaty Organization, or in 2013 entering customs union instead of signing association agreement with the European Union, Armenia has referred to the choice of security considerations over system of values, and apparently Nagorno-Karabakh conflict has been very essential in these choices. However, as we saw, this choice didn't help Armenia because during the war, it was relying on Russia to intervene and stop the war, but it didn't happen on time. It happened when it was already quite late, and Armenian side has lost even Shushi and Hadrut, which were part of Nagorno-Karabakh autonomous oblast in the Soviet Union. The next point is the use of military force. Basically, Azerbaijan is trying to legitimize its use of military force in 2020, justifying it by the notion of restoring its territorial integrity and trying almost to make it as a legitimate legitimate means of conflict resolution, which apparently prompted Russia to start its use of force in Ukraine. And indifference of international community contributed to it. And here, of course, we cannot ignore the energy factor, because Azerbaijan possesses oil and gas resources. They are now seen as alternative to Russian gas for Europe, and of course it plays a certain role for the international community not to focus on the authoritarian nature of Azerbaijan and its human rights violations, including violation of international humanitarian law and committing war crimes in Artsakh. The next one is democracy. As we said here, not only Armenia but also Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh is much more democratic than Azerbaijan. In Freedom House rankings, which is the only organization that does democracy rankings not only in recognized states but also in unrecognized territories, Artsakh was always highest in its rankings of democracy and civil and political liberties amongst all other territories in European neighborhood. And by the way, unlike Kosovo or East Timor, it has established its governance institutions on its own without international support, while international community has provided huge support in Kosovo, East Timor to establish governance institutions. But there is one more aspect that is often ignored, and it is diplomatic strategies and communication of the parties to the conflict. Apparently, some parties of the conflict are more effective in their diplomatic strategies and strategic communication than others. Here, to be very self-critical, I completely agree with Mr. Kirakosyan. Armenia has largely failed to use international legal mechanisms between the first and second Nagorno-Karabakh wars. And Anna asked this question, why? As somebody who has actually worked in the Armenian foreign ministry for over a decade, I have observed a certain skepticism, lack of trust of Armenian diplomacy in those mechanisms. And again, it was also conditioned with the factor, with this consciousness that Armenia is a small state, and lack of understanding that actually international law serves exactly the interests of small states, because big states, powerful states, don't really need it. They can promote their interests even without them, without international law. And even now, there is a school of Armenian experts who have this feeling of being fatalistically, geopolitically condemned in the game of large, big powers, and they feel like international law is not going to help them. And I personally completely share Mr. Kirakosyan's view that it has been a huge mistake, and we had to use those mechanisms properly. And now we are trying to use them, but it's a bit late. I mean, it's never too late, but at least now we are making an effort after the recent war. And finally, about human rights violations, because when you have a conflict, parties are always accusing each other in committing war crimes and human rights violations. Conflicts are never black and white. Whenever you have a conflict, you never have one side which has never committed any human rights violation and another side which has been committed all of them. In the same East Timor and Kosovo, there have been human rights violations and war crimes committed by all sides. Whenever you have a guerrilla war, you do have violations of international humanitarian law. When I was working in Kosovo, the Prime Minister of Kosovo has been Hashim Thaçi, who was then indicted by UN court in the Hague for certain human rights and humanitarian law violations. So it's never black and white, and they didn't actually prevent the international community, European institutions, to support Kosovo to become independent. And of course, many claim that it was because of geopolitical interests. And of course, there was an element of it, but there was also a strong element of human rights violations, of the risk of ethnic cleansing there. So it's never simple. Those factors are very, very complex. And after the second war in Artsakh, Azerbaijan not only hasn't stopped, but has even developed further its very aggressive war of diplomatic narratives. While during 27 years, Azerbaijan was not admitting, and it doesn't admit until now, that in response to peaceful self-determination claimed by Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, it has started massacres in Sumgait and Baku, and then it has started large-scale military operations. Armenia was a little passive, not really advocating for its cause so much, but just rather being in a reactive mode, responding to Azerbaijani claims. And now we have a situation when Azerbaijan is actually legitimizing the use of military force, as I mentioned before, and not admitting human rights and humanitarian law violations during the recent conflict, and trying to mirror all those accusations on the Armenian side. And of course, we should admit that there have been certain human rights violations also by the Armenian side during both wars. Nobody can deny it, but I think when the international community approaches these issues, there are normally two factors that play a role. First, who has started, who has initiated, who has really provoked large-scale human rights and humanitarian law violations. And second, the scale and the extent of them. So I think those two components have need to be taken into account. And another interesting factor is that Azerbaijan is trying to stigmatize Armenia also amongst, in light of the Ukrainian conflict, largely claiming that Armenia is an ally to Russia, and at the same time, on February 22 this year, literally one day before the start of the war in Ukraine, their President Aliyev signed a declaration with Putin that elevated their already quite strategic partnership to the level of strategic alliance. And Azerbaijan tends to pretend that this declaration hasn't been signed when it interacts with Western interlocutors and trying to stigmatize Armenia as a Russian ally, while Russia has been voting in a completely similar manner as Azerbaijan in the UN on the votes in Ukraine, and also has diversified its foreign policy even more since the beginning of the Ukrainian war, conducting many visits to Europe, also visiting the European Union HQ, NATO HQ, United States, and a lot of European states. So as you see, it's not black and white, and we can conclude that the number of factors that shape international communities' approaches to different wars and conflicts can be grouped like this: international law, and here the conflicting principles of territorial integrity and self-determination and human rights and humanitarian law violations. The second is foreign policy choices, alliances and partnerships of the parties to the conflicts, and how effective they are in their diplomatic strategies and strategic communication. Apparently also their governance systems, whether they are a democracy or autocracy, play a certain but not too defining roles in shaping those attitudes. And also here it's important in relation to diplomatic strategies whether those states try to maintain power balance between different major actors, or they bandwagon to a big major power, and if they do bandwagon, whom they choose as their main ally. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sossi. And we are short of time, but I would like to continue a little bit. We'll go into the break. We will have a break, coffee hour, I promise. There's snacks outside. But Sossi, I wanted to reflect on something that you said, which I think is really important. You used the word, some of the conflicts have been stigmatized, and you mentioned, and I fully agree with that, the conflicts in Moldova, Abkhazia, Ossetia, in Georgia, and now Nagorno-Karabakh, which so far has been treated differently. And I think that's a hugely important point, which leads me to my question that perhaps all of the panelists, if they wish to pick it up, is that we have been lamenting about the weakening of the rule of law, the quote-unquote liberal rules-based world order is declining, which turns out that it's not always very liberal, and that the order is still very limited, and sometimes the international law is being applied selectively. But in the specific case of this armed conflict, with an exception of the Donbass region conflict, all of the conflicts mentioned, some within Russia's sphere of influence, some others, they all are born of very genuine, deep pre-Soviet, deeply imperial issues of minority claims, which leads me to think that this rules-based world order, liberal rules-based world order, essentially has been carried on the back of these minorities, right? And essentially every system is as strong as its weakest link. And unless the minority protection is elevated in the international law, Russia is going to take advantage of the security gaps that exist. Russia does not create cleavages, with an exception to Ukraine again, but it exploits the existing ones. So the question I have is how would you assess the strength of the international law in minority protection, in the rights of minority protection? And then one more point, again, there might not be time for you perhaps to get to the two questions, I simply wanted to get it out there, as to what extent it's that speaks to the general theme of the panel, to what extent the international law is sensitive to the world order at the time. So for example, I fully agree that there are specific international humanitarian law arguments that allowed the recognition, the remedial sovereignty of Kosovo. But I wonder if Kosovo conflict erupted within the same way now, whether that would have been possible. I'm worried. I mean, as we speak, there's the Tigray conflict in Ethiopia, right, that has been raging. We had a very gross violation of human rights of the Karen, I believe is the minority name, in Myanmar. And that's only 1-2 cases out of perhaps 70 that right now exist in the world. But each year you have about 70 conflicts, right? So that's my other concern. To what extent is the international law subject or limited there? I fully agree. There seems to be a consensus on this panel that small states need to utilize international law, and that even if great power rivalry heightened, that doesn't mean that international law does not matter. But at the same time, I guess, looking from the other side, what are the limits, geopolitical or political limits of international law, considering that some of the states are very deeply authoritarian, so they are not going to abide the international, support the international law to consensus. So I'm going to, unless there are questions from the audience, I will, there is a question. Let's take a question. Oh, there are 2 questions, so 1 and 2. So very good. Let me parse out the woman over here and the gentleman in the back.
Very much for the very insightful talks. Just follow-up question on the development of the discussion. An emergence of new consequences, particular responsibility to protect ATP and legal succession. So my question is, what is the reason whether those principles, new principles, are or were applicable to Asante case? And in case of the answer is yes, they are. What is the reason of Armenia's reluctance to use those principles and concepts in the resolution of the conflict? I just really can get it. Thank you.
Very good. We'll have Dr. Kirakosyan tackle that. But let me take another question in the back. Elise, there is a question in the back. If you could pass the.
Sorry, I go to speak in Armenian.
That's okay. Well, we'll translate because we have an international audience. Go right ahead.
Armenian Kirakosyan, national Marsh, Yeghishe Kirakosyanին, Պարոն Kirakosyan, այս պայմանությամբ տեղակայում որ հանգայով Ադրբեջանի դեմ հայց է ներկայացված, նկատակներ ներկայացված, ինչ ընթացքի մեջ են այս պայքարը գտնվում, եւ երկրորդ հարցը, որպես նաեւ Հայաստանի Հանրապետության քաղաքացի, ուզում եմ դիմանալ ձեր կարծիքը Արցախի հանրապետության եւ Ադրբեջանի հանրապետության միջեւ տեղակայված Ռուսաստանի Դաշնության կողմից խաղապահ զորքերի գործառույթները ինչ տեսակի ֆորմատով է գալու եւ ինչպեսի դրանք կտակ այդ ամենի շնորհակալություն։
So, for the sake of time, Yeghishe, I think you answered the first question in your presentation, but feel free to comment again, but perhaps we'll get to the second one. But maybe, Sossi also can comment on remedial sovereignty. I'm going to start with Yeghishe.
Sure. With regard to remedial secession, right? That was the question. R2P and remedial secession. R2P and remedial secession. First, I'll start with remedial secession, and then I'll go to R2P. Then I think colleagues will complement that. Remedial secession is not a new concept. Let's put it this way: it's the newly used term to describe the external self-determination, a form of self-determination. The term has been coined, I think, and used in the past couple of decades. Especially, it started in the mid-90s, and then going to Kosovo advisory opinion. There, I think it was in the legal opinion presented by the United Kingdom, where the term external remedial self-determination was used. Remedial self-determination, not remedial secession. Then I think it started used by many authors, many commentators, many academic people that they started using remedial secession, which technically is an attempt to extend the notion of self-determination also, because initially and originally the notion of self-determination was designed to, it was limited to colonial context. It started getting extended maybe like after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they started extending the notion in the 90s and onwards. And I'm not sure why it has not been used, including the R2P doctrine. R2P is relatively new. It's not maybe the legal basics are not quite new, but I think up to this point, colleagues will correct me if I'm wrong, but we don't have a very certain legal documents underpinning those. We have a lot of resolutions which are lying under the doctrine and try, but I think there is still a lot to go. And I would say that the doctrine, the full implementation of the R2P doctrine is very tightly connected with the reform in the UN. We spoke about the impasse, and we spoke about the deadlock that, for example, the Security Council finds itself right now. That's very important, and I think that's also important in terms of the R2P, because R2P doctrine, I think we need to, and I agree with Anna that international law has been developed in those critical moments, and most of the groundbreaking changes and the new developments have been happening in very groundbreaking, like in very crisis moments, when the international community was facing a huge crisis. That was the First World War, that was the Second World War. I think it's now is also a time, unfortunately. Yeah.
1815.
We had the
Vienna Congress, right?
Yes.
That was the
Yes.
post-Napoleonic
Yes.
Wars.
You had the Westphalian international law, then you had the new era of international, we started maybe in 1928 after the Second World War. Then you had the UN and the new era of international. I think now we're coming to the end of that. That's my feeling, because a lot of concepts, a lot of institutions failed, unfortunately. And in the past decade, I think the Security Council is finding itself very, very hard to act. And it was the General Assembly which replaced the Security Council, and we adopted a resolution in case of Ukraine, but Arna did it good anyway. So that's to answer to your question. Why Armenia has not been using these two concepts in reality? Armenia has been using those, but Armenia has been using very back. That's the problem. Armenia has been using the concept of self-determination, which, as Sossi pointed out rightly, it's quite back. Like we don't know what does it mean. It can mean an autonomy and inside Azerbaijan, and it can mean an independent country, and it can mean that Azerbaijan join Armenia. Like all that, it can include all of these possible options. So, and maybe that was one of the reasons why we failed, because we haven't been precise enough. We haven't been very articulate enough to deliver our message. Because that's the thing. Because now we're speaking about remedial secession, we're speaking speaking about Armenia's sovereignty or self-determination. Well, why are we speaking about that? Because we are speaking about the context in which ethnic Armenians find and will find themselves ourselves to be part of Azerbaijan. That's it's incomprehensible because the atmosphere of hatred that exists in the country towards ethnic Armenians that will result in ethnic cleansing. That's a very straightforward answer. With regard to the other questions relating to the ICJ proceedings, I think that covered that. We have, yeah, okay, yeah, Russian peacekeepers, I think it's not fine. So I can comment on that because it's completely outside my scope. I reserve to comment.
She's an independent consultant, so she can.
Thank you. Let's start from the question on the Russian peacekeeping, since I've written about it. So the issue is that normally when you have such a conflict, you should have an international peacekeeping mission, which has a mandate from an international organization. Preferably from the UN Security Council, but it could also be from OSCE or European Union. If it's an African country, African Union, so the main issue is that Russian peacekeeping contingent doesn't have a mandate from an international security. Its legal mandate is actually November 9 statement, which is not an agreement or a treaty, it's a statement. And Azerbaijan is, the other issue is that it consists of only one nation, which means that basically this nation has its own geopolitical interests or its own, let's say, security issues or economic issues as it may have in light of the current situation, then it may suddenly decide to withdraw. We cannot exclude it. You know, and the third is that international peacekeeping mission doesn't just mean military moves. In Armenia, everybody understands that military peacekeeping mission means military moves. I worked in 7-8 peacekeeping mission. It's a very complex mechanism which includes military contingent, a civilian component, and often also a police component. And it includes many nations. It can include several international organizations. I'll bring an example from Central African Republic, which was based on responsibility to protect mandate. Because what happened there was that it was an intra-state, inter-ethnic, sectarian conflict. And literally a genocide was starting there. So first, the French unilateral military contingent was deployed to stop literally the genocide. Then it was African Union and European Union military force, military components. And then it was a large UN peacekeeping mission because it takes time to establish a large UN peacekeeping mission, which was 12,000 people, which consisted of military, civilian, and police components. And so it was a very complex mechanism, and it was the same in Kosovo. In Kosovo, there were several, like it was NATO, UN, European Union, OSCE, and they evolved. Their mandates and nature of their missions evolved over time. And now I can also address Nora's question, why Armenia has been reluctant. It's a very complex question, to be frank with you. One is this, what Mr. Kirakosyan and I referred to about this diplomatic strategy issue, that Armenians tend to be skeptical about international law and multilateral mechanisms and rely more on geopolitical dynamics. And the other question is that actually this remaining secession, you will not find it in any UN or any other official document. You will find it only in academia and practitioner papers, because it is never mentioned in the UN. Instead, they mention this responsibility to protect. officially starting in mid-20s. And responsibility to protect is a very important principle. However, in order to establish a UN peacekeeping mission based on that principle, you need to have a consent of all parties of the conflict. So basically, you need the consent of Azerbaijan to establish an international peacekeeping mission. And also of all, 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, plus it should be 9 in favor, including no veto from any of the 5 permanent members. So it's very complex. And now I respond to Anna's question about whether
Minority protection.
a minority, I'm sorry, I think it's more mistaken, because it's really not my strength. But I'll answer to your other question about what in Kosovo conflict happened now. I frankly don't know, because when I was studying in Harvard, it was during, and also I took some courses in Fletcher. It was exactly the period when NATO intervened to stop these massacres in Kosovo, and all of our case studies were about Kosovo or Bosnia, which also had a very severe situation of massacres and human rights violations, and that's how my mentality was shaped during that period. And also then I had the practical work in Kosovo and East Timor that reinforced it. However, now we really live in a different world. That time it was Clinton's administration, which was a very strong liberalist administration. So it was, although there is a view that it was just a cover up. In the reality, they were pursuing geopolitical interests and not human rights values. In the reality, I think it's always a mixture. It's always a combination. You cannot just say, oh, they were just pursuing human rights values or they were just led by geopolitical interests. That's why I'm saying the correlation of those factors should be examined, and not just not any of them in a vacuum. And yes, now it could be different. And by the way, since the Artsakh war in 2020 and Ukrainian war, there are some problems in those same areas. Like in Kosovo, there are concerns. In Bosnia, there are concerns. And in Western Sahara, there are tensions between Morocco and Algeria. So now those dynamics around those conflicts are also posing a lot of concern. It's not excluded that those conflicts that are considered resolved, like in Kosovo or Bosnia, suddenly something will escalate there again. So it's a serious concern now. Thank you.
So maybe we'll conclude. Anna, if you wanted to comment on any of this, and maybe if Yeghishe could comment on the Minority Protection International Law, and we'll then move to coffee and snacks.
Yeah, minority in the international law, meaning that using
In general, systemic level minority protection, because normally it's domestic politics, right? States are supposed to be protecting their minorities.
yeah.
And then you have what I call the tyranny of territorial sovereignty, which pretty much allows many countries to do whatever they want internally. And that's how we end up with so many problems.
You have different levels of protection for minorities in different settings, including the UN system, but specifically, if speaking about Armenia, speaking about our region, you have the Council of Europe system, for example. They have the Framework Convention on the Protection of National Minorities, which is one of the core instruments that Armenia is also party to that, and there is also creating a lot of international commitments for the countries to, specifically in that regard, to protect the national minorities living in the country and preserving their identity, cultural identity, and their rights, etc., and so forth. And there are also many other instruments that are particular. But regard to, I think I want to tackle another question. I wanted to quickly comment on the territorial integrity and self-determination. And again, again, connected to the legal succession issue, which is a very hotly debated and also have been always discussed in the public and debated in the academia, is continuing to be discussed. Just from the legal perspective, I know that's from legal perspective, from reality perspective, there is a conflict. There is definitely a conflict because if we are speaking about the external self-determination, there should be a violation or breach of territorial integrity of the state, because a part of the state is leaving that state and joining another country or creating an independent. But from legal point of view, this is a little bit different, and this question has been somehow maybe closed or somehow answered by the court, the International Court of Justice, when the court was issuing the advisory opinion on the Kosovo matter. And most of the, by the way, during this proceeding, this is an interesting phenomenon that during these advisory proceedings, most of the member states submitting their legal positions with regard to the question presented by the General Assembly, whether the self-governing bodies of Kosovo, whether the declaration of independence was in compliance with international law, whether international law contained any provision that prohibited them to declare independence. Most of the legal observations presented by member states included references to medical secession, to self-determination, to this core concept. But the court was trying to avoid getting into this. The court actually started discussing only purely the international law, whether that allows or disallows the declaration of independence per se. But having said that, the court also, but nevertheless, the court touched upon this conflict of territorial, semi-conflict of territorial integrity and self-determination, saying that the notion of territorial integrity creates commitments and obligations for member states and not for the peoples fighting for their self-determination. And self-determination is a concept applicable to these units only. And thus, it's alleviating conflict that's all possible conflicts. This is also in line with the 1970 Declaration on Foreign Relations and International Principles of International Law, which has this famous safeguard clause, which is contained in the elaboration of the principle of self-determination, which says, I'm not quoting, I'm just paraphrasing that, which says technically that we read it in the direct term, that the territorial integrity of those states which comply with the requirements of the principles of equal rights and self-determination of peoples will not be violated. Which, if we read it reversely, it means that if these states are conducted in violation of the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, can be violated. This is the safeguard clause contained in the 1970 Declaration on the Principles of International Law, which was adopted by the General Assembly by a consensus, and it is the main document, a commentary, let's say in a way, of the principles of the UN Charter established. And this is interesting. Yes, and although we can understand, we understand that this was adopted in the context of colonial, the colonization. Because it was in the 1970s, but nevertheless, it still exists.
There's also
Thank you.
General Assembly resolution, 1990 something.
I think it will be another declaration or something.
Which says that if the state violates the rights, there's also a UN General Assembly resolution from the, I think, 97 or 98. Which claims basically if the state tries to oppress self-determination movements and acts against I don't remember the exact wording, but basically if it doesn't protect its minority groups and civilian population, instead trying to oppress any movement of self-determination, then state kind of loses this, this justification of its territorial integrity, articles, the state has a primary obligation to protect its civilian population, including minority groups, all of them.
We should let that, pass that message to a lot of actors around the world, right, starting with President Aliyev. Thank you so very much for such a rich discussion to all three of you. We know you're very busy people. Please join me in thanking them, our speakers, for this really generous and thoughtful responses. So we're a little bit behind. It's definitely worth it. So what I would like to suggest is we go for a break, and after this, I'm supposed to lead a workshop on how we just pacify. But I'd like to suggest that we convene back here, and I'm going to change the format. It won't be a workshop. I'll deliver a presentation, concise form. We can discuss it here. So let's break now and come back here at 3:15, if possible. Yeah. So I'll see you all at 3:15 here. Yeah. Thank you very much.